Welcome to BizMeds with Darius and Saad, where we give you the medications for your business. This podcast is all about the minimum effective doses you need to make a massive improvement in your business. Listen and enjoy.
Hey everyone, welcome back again for another episode with your hosts. My name is Saad.
And I'm Darius.
For today's episode
Of our podcast
named
BizMeds.
Sorry, I just skipped over that. For today's episode, we want to talk about the flow cycle. And this kind of ties back into our last episode where we were talking about the afterburner frame effect. So on my way here, there's a few people asking me like, hey, what are you up to tonight? And I mentioned that I was going to be recording the podcast today. And everybody curiously asked like what the topic's going to be. And, you know, in the same fashion you sent it to me, I was like, flow cycle. And everybody was like, what is the flow cycle? So let's start there. What is the flow cycle, Darius?
Okay, so flow cycle. Well, I think it touched when we talked about the afterburner framework, right? We talked and we discussed it kind of at length. It kind of gave, you know, hey, there is an actual recipe. There's a formula for getting into flow, right? So those states of really deep embodiment where we talked about it, right? Like it's the times where you're just so focused on what you're doing is you kind of get in the zone, right? And so it's really a 4-stage formula. And it really starts out with, it's called the struggle phase. And from the struggle phase, you go into release, then we go into flow, and then we go into recovery. So those are the 4 main cycles of flow. But I think it's really, it probably will help everyone if they really understand that, you know, the idea of flow is really, we talk about it's a part of neuroscience and not really many people talk about it and it's not really well known. Well, just so if people out there wanting to do their own research, right, they can go look up, his name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and it does not spell any way the way it sounds.
That spelling is crazy.
But if you look up there, he wrote a book in the 70s called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. And you'll see it's Mihai, it's pronounced Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he's kind of known as the godfather of flow. And so he was a psychologist in the 1970s. He did the kind of the largest study on what it was like about happiness and how people are getting in the zone and things like that. So that's where the idea of flow kind of crystallized, was because of the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and his book called Flow, you know, the Psychology of Optimal Experience. And that's where that starts from. And through the study is actually how they discovered that there is this 4-stage process, and the flow cycle kind of began. And they started doing all sorts of studies around that, and how did that play out in the brain, and how did that come into our experience of flow. And now we know that there are these 4 cycles. So if anyone's wondering, again, it's struggle, release, flow, recovery.
So flow is within flow itself, like that's a branch of flow.
Yeah, so flow, everyone likes to say, oh, I want to get in flow, but there's actually a process to get into flow. You can't just jump right into, you don't really go right into flow. If you are, well, then you've gone through the struggle and release phases first to get into flow. And then on the backside, which is probably, or the final phase you're supposed to go into is recovery. And as you become a lot more, familiar getting into a flow state, then you start to understand, what that recovery is and things like that. So that's the flow cycle in a nutshell. So
let me ask you this, now that we have an understanding of what flow is and the cycles of flow, and it's not really an abbreviation, but everything that falls under flow, what are the triggers? How does one get into flow?
Okay, so there's, what they found through the research is there's really 22 flow triggers. So things that will help to trigger a flow state. And I'll maybe preempt you, there's also things that block you from getting into flow as well. So there's so the flow triggers, there's both individual flow triggers, but there's also group triggers. You can actually trigger a group flow session as well. But I think for this, we'll stick really tight on what the individual flow triggers are.
I was gonna say, like, how do you do it with a group?
That's beyond the scope of this podcast.
Is that the purpose of like those group classes in the gym?
I mean,
everybody.
there are
30-minute flow session.
There are definitely ways to, when you are actually managing projects or even other sports, you can get into group flow. And there's actually ways you can do that. But we'll focus only on how do I, as a person who wants to experience more flow and enjoyment in my life, get into flow. Okay. So there's really, at the top of it, there's things that kind of evoke curiosity, passion, and purpose. Right. And those kind of work together. It's not one, those three kind of work together. There's also this idea of autonomy. So you have a great deal of, you are kind of the master of what that is, right? You control that. So it gives you, or an exercise that you have a lot of autonomy in, right? You're not really governed at. Also, complete concentration is another one. So you're completely focused on something that is in and of itself, a flow trigger. So not only going into flow, but having that is an additional flow trigger. There's an element of risk or novelty. And that I think is really when you'll see this a lot with extreme sports, because flow states are all over extreme sports.
So would you say extreme sports like Olympic sports or something on
X Games? So snowboarding, alpine skiing, downhill skiing, a lot of those things, mountaineering, more the extreme stuff where you are fully present, you're fully dialed in. There can be a large element of risk. Over the years, you probably see, let's say the world of snowboarding, right? Over, when snowboarding first came out and then to where we are now, there's been like an exponential growth in terms of or advancement in what people have been able to do. And that's because in flow states, I think even McKinsey a few years back did a study on CEOs, and they found that when they're in flow, there's upwards of a 500% increase in output, and that goes with like creativity and all these things. So flow tends to show up on a lot of those because I'll say extreme sports, because of that risk and novelty that's associated with that. There's a lot of autonomy, there's a lot of passion, purpose, all those things. Kind of like it's a very flow trigger rich environment. So there's also things that, complexity or unpredictability also play a part into those. Things that involve deep embodiment, so it's really meaningful and work or things like that. Immediate feedback is another flow trigger. Clear goals. I think we talked about that in 2 episodes ago in the Afterburner framework, talking about flow and how having really clear goals is really important. Well, the reason having really clear goals is to flow is because it helps drive you into a flow state, right? And then we have, there's this thing called the challenge skills ratio. So when you're going to do something, if it's too challenging, right, it's demotivating,
right,
and there's a high probability we won't get into flow. Yeah. And on the other side, if it's not challenging enough, it's too easy. There's not enough there to really get us into a flow state. So there's an optimal challenge skills ratio that we want to aim for. That's will help us get in, that triggers flow.
Sorry, just to cut you off there. Can somebody force themselves into the flow state if, say, it's either too easy and too hard?
So the probability that you get into flow if it's too hard, again, will become a flow blocker. So the chances are you'll end up in that first phase,
Spoilers.
That struggle phase.
Spoilers.
If it's too hard, guaranteed struggle. And you will stay in that struggle phase. Okay. And you won't actually release and get into flow.
Yeah.
And then there's creativity and pattern recognition are also other flow triggers. So I don't think we need to spend too much time in those, other than that's, for the most part, individual flow triggers. So when you have an activity that has a lot of those, and the more you have of those, the easier it's going to get into a flow state.
Okay. So since we've already spoiled it a little bit, how about we continue talking about what the barriers might be and how flow can be How do you prevent yourself from getting into flow?
Well, okay, so flow blockers, right? That's, I think it's the easiest way we're talking about it. Well, exhaustion, right? So if we're exhausted, we're physically exhausted, then there's a high probability we're not getting into flow. So it's, when we work with clients around, helping them get into flow states, the big thing is make sure you're properly rested, which is why that recovery phase is so important. But, so there's overwhelm, burnout, distraction, like those are probably your top major flow blockers right off the bat, right? So all those things that are really kind of like really heavy on you, you're not going to have that mental energy, right? High cognitive load things.
Yeah.
So we go back to one of the first episodes, we talked about cognitive load. That's it right there. Cognitive load will be a huge flow blocker, which is why we talked about why it's important to deal with that cognitive load up front and give yourself that horsepower, that mental and emotional horsepower back. Mindset, if we have a very negative mindset approaching it, then of course that's going to be a flow blocker. We won't believe that we're able to get into flow. Self-sabotage. So if we just have actions that we just self-sabotage all the time, then again, it's a big flow blocker. Time, if we're feeling that we don't have enough time, things like that, or we're being rushed or any time constraint, again, that can be a flow blocker. Stress, motivation level, and then also lack of clarity. So the complete opposite of having clear goals is lack of clarity will also prevent someone from going into a flow state.
Right.
And I really want to point out, so between those two is right. So we have our we want to make sure our environment is flow trigger abundant as possible. Right. And that's in the struggle phase, right? So we have to go back to that whole flow cycle. Is the first phase of that is the struggle phase. And that's where, it is exactly what it sounds like. It feels hard, right? We're trying to do something and it's frustrating and a lot of times people will stay in that because what'll happen is those flow blockers might start to creep in, the mindset and things like that. And there's an important part in there, which is that release phase, right? And those releases can be very simple. It could be as simple as just taking a step back and just doing a simple box breathing exercise, and that will suddenly just release. Sometimes it'll be that idea of like the shower thoughts, just something not overly stimulating, but enough just to kind of release our attention for a second to allow us to then get back into and really drop into a deep flow state. And that's where the magic starts to happen, because I don't think we've really talked enough about the benefits of going into flow. We kind of touched on it in the afterburner framework.
Right.
And really, why we want to leverage flow is because in flow, especially as a business owner, entrepreneur, we can get so much more done. And we're talking, the magnitude, according to the McKinsey study, was like 500% increase in output. Like that's a tremendous leverage tool that we can use. Not only that, but flow in and of itself is a rewarding experience. And so the more flow you have in your life, guess what? Overall, you're a happy human being, right?
So things are getting done. Your task list is not piling up. Yeah, exactly.
Your cognitive load's going down. You suddenly have the energy. And one of the easiest things people can do, so for those of you who are listening, I'm going to give you the kind of the key right off the bat. If you want to have that right away in your life, is think about the times where you have felt that really just dialed in, and like, what activities have you been doing, right? It might not necessarily be something related to your business, probably not. For me, I have a few main flow activities, right? So in the winter, snowboarding, 100%. Like you want to talk about flow triggers, that is a huge flow environment, and being able to get in there and, you get to have that autonomy. There's a challenge skills ratio. It's just, there's some risk and novelty, unpredictability, all those things. So for me,
and it's intriguing, like you said. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Right. And it'll grab your interest and your deep embodiment, all those things. Right. Or probably when I was younger, speed skating, when I competed as a speed skater, and I can still remember being in that zone and touching on those things. Summertime, it's more going to be, taking the motorcycle to the track. Yeah. You talk about being completely focused in the moment and like flow state. That's it right there. Even riding, because you're just closed off from everything else. Mm-hmm. So going back, so I want people to think about is like, what are those activities that I can remember doing that have induced me to that flow state.
Yeah.
And just schedule some more of those activities on a weekly basis into your life. And overall, you will be probably happier than you've been in a while, because flow is such an intrinsically rewarding experience, then you'll have more of that.
Yeah. So now that we've touched on how flow cycle is such a rewarding experience, how can business owners leverage this in their day-to-day to get the best out of their days?
Yeah. And yeah, we talked about this before, and it's something that we do, and we are very on top.
I got a pretty cool story about how it's helped me, but please continue.
So so staying true to the podcast goal is, hey, let's talk about something that's important. Now, how can I actually apply this?
Yeah.
So I think the thing is, as much as I feel like we're going to sometimes beat this to death, the idea of it's situational dependent, here we're going to be way more prescriptive in this one. Okay. So I think the first thing is, one, we talked about, hey, you can start to leverage those flow activities in your week, right? So set a time. Some people might be reading or whatever it is. Now, how do I then take advantage of a flow state? Well, the easiest way you're going to be able to do that is block out some time. You're going to have to block out some time. And ideally, we're talking 60 to 90 minutes. I know that sounds like a lot for some people, and they're like, oh, wow, I don't. And this is where the science speaks for itself. It will, once you go through this once, it will, it's probably not going to be amazing because it'll be your first time doing it. That's just what it is. But it will be phenomenally better than what you've been doing, which is leading a pretty distracted life without even knowing it. So what you're going to do is you're going to block out 60 to 90 minutes. I think that's a really good one to start with. And if you don't have 60 to 90 minutes, then do 45. And I would say it's got to be at least 30 minutes, at a very minimum 30 minutes, because you have to understand you're going to go through struggle phase. And through struggle phase is going to take up some time, and you have to be able to get to release and into flow. So if you only have 30 minutes, do 30 minutes. If you have 45 minutes, do 45 minutes. 60 minutes, do 60 minutes. Even 90, go for 90. If you got 2 hours, you really want to go gung-ho, go for 2 hours, right? But in the terms of, we bring it back to one of the first frameworks we talked about, rational versus reasonable.
Is it rational?
It's rational, maybe 2 hours. Is it reasonable? Only your schedule will be able to determine that, right? Yeah. So schedule that time first and foremost. That's step one, and block it off. Now, you're going to have to think about what it is that you're going to work on for that time. Okay, so one of the biggest leverage factors you have is setting a really clear goal as to what you want to get out of that session. Yeah. Okay.
So would you say this is prior to getting into the flow cycle?
Absolutely.
Planning the flow cycle?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. So this is the work that comes up front, because when you go into a flow, we'll call it flow block or flow time, it has to be nothing but buttery execution. It's just basic go in, everything. You have zero cognitive load around this. You already know everything that's going to happen. Everything's already done. You just go and you go into flow. Okay. So that's a really good point that you brought up. So we're going to do the upfront work. So we have to be very clear, very crystal clear. And there's probably a lot more we could talk about around clear goals, which we may not have time today. But having a really clear goal as to what you're going to accomplish in that time, and understand that the first time or two that you do it, it's really about figuring out what you actually can accomplish in that time. You may underestimate what you can do when you are really focused and your output is at the minimum doubled. And so you might find you have a lot more time left over to do, and which is okay, because then guess what? You can then, next time you do it, you'll have a better idea of how much you can actually do. Now, so what you want to do is make sure that you've scheduled the time, you have a really clear goal, because again, that is a flow trigger, right? Now what we want to do is we want to minimize the things that are going to prevent us from getting into flow. So a lot of that's going to be distraction. The biggest distraction.
Oh no, don't say it.
Take a guess.
Phones.
No, absolutely. 1,000,000%, it's your phone. How many times I will probably people get sick of us saying this is that there is a war for our attention, and we don't even know it because there's an army of scientists that their sole job is to capture our attention. And the easiest thing that we have is our phones, and it's there and it's so accessible. And most of the time we don't even realize that we're distracted. And what happens is, or we try to sit down to do something, and within about 5 minutes, I have a notification, or someone's trying to call me, or whatever it is. So
I'm bored. Like nothing's happened in the last 5 minutes. Let's see what's going on online.
Exactly. And in this case, boredom is your friend, because doing the work is actually going to be more exciting than sitting there being bored. So we have to reduce the amount of distraction that we're going to be exposed to. Now, you have a limited time. We won't be able to talk about limited distraction coming from your own brain, but as much as we can, we want to minimize the amount of external distraction. So put your phone away. Ideally, you turn it off.
D&D.
Turn it off.
Not even D&D.
You don't turn it off. Put it in another room. Okay. And so I'll say, I know from my own personal experience is that when I do my flow days, I actually will leave it up in the bathroom, turned off, and I won't even go and touch it.
What about does your watch bug you? Because
no.
my watch every hour, if I have it on and it's like, hey buddy, time to get up.
So I have silenced everything. This one here tracks my steps and my heart rate, and that's all I ever use it for. It does nothing else. And which is why I have another watch that is literally just tells the time.
Oh.
So again, I'm limiting the dopamine hits because I'm not worried about what's happening on my wrist. It's not buzzing at me. It's not doing so. And if you have a smartwatch, take it off or silence everything.
Control of your attention.
Absolutely, right? I'm going to fight back.
It's mine.
Cannot have it. So again, your phone's going to be the big one. Your external environment. So if your office or whatever it is you're working in, it's kind of like you might have to shut the blinds a little bit. You might have to clean off your desk, right? So there's nothing distracting you. Get yourself a notepad. So as you're doing your work, if something does come up, you can just write it down and it just externalizes it and you can just review it later.
So right now we're at clear up your cognitive load,
absolutely.
Set appropriate goals.
Very clear goals.
Very clear goals.
Yes.
And that like clear goals and objectives on what it is that you're doing to right?
What you're going to achieve for your flow session. Right?
And the third one is reduce distractions.
Reduce and remove a distraction. Make sure you've got proper rest, right? Like those things. So we talked about all the flow blockers and that, and kind of approach it like a binary on off, right? I'm going to go into my flow session. So I'm turning the world off. I'm going into my bubble, and here I am. I'm in the little cockpit of this is what it is, and I'm going to do this. And if you do that for, 30 minutes or 60 minutes, 90 minutes, it will definitely change how you perceive how much work that you can actually accomplish.
Right. So for all the people that are gym goers that are listening to this podcast, what do they do if they are getting short on their protein intake and need to take a quick little break? Should that be scheduled into the flow cycle? What about the food? The
nutrition. Here we are talking about the gym again. So from a nutrition standpoint, I mean, you know what? Ideally, you've planned out your water in advance. While you're doing your flow session, if it's 90 minutes, eat your protein or wait till after. It's not a gym session, so you don't have to worry. But you actually do bring an important part, and we joke about it, is actually the recovery part. Yeah. And recovery is not only rest, because going into flow is very neurochemically intensive. We burn up a lot of dopamine, oxytocin, norepinephrine. There's a lot of brain chemicals, neurochemicals that we're burning up. That's why rest, nutrition, all those things are really important after the fact to help replenish those neurochemicals so that we can go into flow again. A lot of people they circumvent it and they try to shortcut and get back in. And if they don't get the proper recovery in, guess what? You won't get back into flow because you don't have the abundance of neurochemicals to get you back into flow again.
My buddies Garrett and Carter, they can't eat an entire pizza the night before and then expect to be top performer the
I
next
feel like
day.
you're calling them out very specifically. I mean, you can try. I mean, there's no sense. I mean, you could experiment, and if it's the night before, maybe get away with it. I mean, ideally, it's probably not setting you up for optimal, getting into flow experience the next day. Definitely not if you're going for a flow day. But maybe if you got a flow block later on the day, you might have recovered enough from that, and you might be okay.
And the call out was with all love, by the way. Please leave a like and subscribe. Share it too as well.
So I think it really sums up the flow cycle. I think everyone will have a good understanding of what the 4 phases of the flow cycle are. You actually can't circumvent the flow cycle. You can't just jump from circle right into flow. There's got to be a release phase. You have to have recovery in there. And the more you go through it, the easier it'll be. So layer that in other activities during the week. And overall, you're going to be a happier person. And which person doesn't want to be a happier person? I'm sure your spouse or partner, children, if you have them, would be wanting
happier. Yeah, exactly. Happier partner. Yeah. People in life are just generally going to be thankful that you were happier going through the day, right?
I think so.
Yeah. So I think this would be a great place to call it. I know you mentioned setting clear objectives, clear goals. Maybe we can discuss that in another podcast to kind of branch on that and help people on setting those clear goals and clear objectives.
I'm sure we'll be able to shed some more light on that in a future podcast. Absolutely up for that. Oh, you were going to share a story on what flow.
I think that'll drag us along a little longer. Let's maybe talk about that in the clear goals and objectives, because I think it falls more in line with the clear goals and objectives.
Okay. So from your own experience, having gone through flow days and flow blocks, have you found the research and the actual science to be true?
It's worked tremendously. Honestly, I stumbled upon, as you mentioned, a lot of people stumble upon flow by accident. So I stumbled upon it by accident. And as I was going through, I was like, this is, I've never experienced this type of concentration, this type of focus, this type of drive before. And it was, now that I think about it, it was the perfect amount of challenge to skill ratio, where I felt challenged, I had the skills, and I had to just take that extra little step above that was out of my quote-unquote comfort zone. And it stimulated my mind in a way that I wanted to be successful, and the outcome was going to be something I looked forward to. So that in itself was just
rewarding experience.
Very rewarding experience, yeah. And I remember talking to you about it after. I was like, holy shit, like I feel so sorry, we'll bleep that out.
No, we won't.
I went through it and I was like, holy crapples, that I felt so mentally free. I didn't feel like there was something that I was carrying throughout the day, constantly worrying about it. And that's kind of falls back into the cognitive load, because it was, well, the concept of cognitive load is constantly carrying things around all day long in your mind and never getting them out or completing your task list.
Yeah.
It was by far one of the best experiences I've had. And I've been, ever since, been chasing that feeling, because it pushed me to do better than I can. And it helped me apply myself to my fullest.
Yeah. Which is, we talk about another benefit of flow. It just raises your overall your overall baseline performance level. Right? Yeah. So now that oh wow, my output was so much more, and then that, not maybe at that level, but your baseline level now improves. It challenges you to now do more at a very baseline, and then you're also happier because you have this very rewarding experience. Not only that, you're accomplishing a lot more, so you feel more fulfilled. And if it's aligned to your passion, purpose, and curiosity, I mean, you are now just fully on board going for what it is that you're aligned to do. And so all of those now are just a huge, feeds back into your belief system, right? And it's now being fulfilled, and now it opens up your belief aperture even more. Talked about that long ago. And it just becomes this amazing flywheel of speed and velocity that it helps propel you forward. So that's why it's always amazes me that such a small part of like current neuroscience, but it's such an amazing thing. And there's, that it's everywhere. And we just want to make sure that enough people have the formula. Here's how to do this, because it is a complete game changer for you.
There's so much research on it still happening. It's a space that not many people know still, which is surprising because this, as you mentioned, has been going all the way back to the 70s. The funny thing is that it also trains your amygdala to not be afraid of challenges. It pushes you to go and challenge yourself to do better. And then when the next challenge comes around, you realize like, hey, I was successful last time. I did a great job at it last time. I can do the same thing again. And then you slowly build that skill and grow yourself.
Absolutely. All right. We are at our time. I love the fact that our camera shuts off at 30 minutes because it keeps us absolutely true.
Well, it was like 28 minutes something. But
I mean, probably. Probably. But it really forces us, again, it is that additional time check on us to make sure that we are being, again, really purposeful with this. So I want to say thank you for co-hosting again. This is phenomenal. Thank you to everyone that's been listening this far, continues to listen. If you're new here, again, we are here to bring you everything that you need to make a massive change in your business for the better in the minimum effective dose style.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Darius, for educating us a bit more on what the flow cycle is and how to trigger it and how to avoid it as well. Reminder, shut down your phones. Do not do D&D.
Turn it off. All right, everyone. We will see you in our next episode.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.